Imagine a brotherhood of warrior monks, sworn to poverty, yet becoming the wealthiest and most powerful force in medieval Europe. They were defenders of pilgrims, crusaders in the Holy Land, and pioneers of global finance. Their name became synonymous with courage, mystery, and unimaginable riches. But their sudden, brutal downfall ignited legends that still echo through the centuries. Welcome to Forbidden Lore, and tonight we uncover the epic saga of the Knights Templar. The world had been cracked open. At the dawn of the 12th century, the armies of the First Crusade had done the impossible. They had marched thousands of miles, endured starvation and disease, and had torn the holy city of Jerusalem from the hands of its Fatimid rulers. The crescent had fallen, and the cross was raised above the city's ancient walls. For the faithful in Europe, it was the fulfillment of a divine promise, an age of miracles. But miracles cast long shadows, and victory is often the mother of new dangers. Imagine the roads of the Holy Land in the years that followed. They were not paved with gold, nor were they guarded by angels. They were little more than dusty, rock-strewn tracks winding through unforgiving hills and desolate valleys. The sun was a merciless hammer beating down on the landscape, and in the shadows of every rock, in the narrow passes of every ravine, death waited. For the thousands of pilgrims who now flocked from across Christendom to see the city of their Christ. The journey to salvation was a descent into hell. They came with calloused feet and prayers on their lips, their life savings stitched into the hems of their tunics. They were shepherds, merchants, and peasants, not soldiers. They were lambs, and the land was filled with wolves. Bands of Saracen, marauders, and common brigands haunted these roads, emerging from the heat haze to rob, to enslave, and to kill. The path to the Holy Sepulchre was littered with the bones of the pious. The dream of the crusade had been achieved, but its promise of a safe kingdom for Christ was a deadly illusion. The ruling Christian nobles, men like King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, were trapped in a paradox. They were lords of a kingdom they could barely control. Their forces stretched thin, perpetually fighting to defend their new borders. They had neither the men nor the resources to police the treacherous 70 miles of road between the port of Jaffa and the gates of Jerusalem. The very people they had fought to protect were being slaughtered within their own realm. The victory felt hollow, the holy city a gilded cage. A solution was needed, but no one knew what it could be. It was in this crucible of faith and fear, in the year of our Lord 1119, that a new idea was born. It did not come from a king or a pope, but from a French knight named Auguste de Molay. He was a veteran of the crusade, a man who had seen the ecstatic highs of victory and the brutal lows of the constant, grinding warfare that followed. He was not a great lord, but a minor noble from the Champagne region of France. Yet he possessed something more valuable than land or titles, a burning, unshakable conviction. He looked at the chaos, at the suffering of the pilgrims, and saw not a military problem, but a spiritual calling. He gathered around him a small circle of like-minded knights. There were 8 others, including the respected and devout Godfrey de Molay. These were not young men hungry for glory. They were seasoned warriors who understood the true cost of violence. They could have returned to their homes in Europe, to their families and estates, to live out their days in peace and honor. But they chose a different path. They chose to stay. They proposed something radical, something the world had never seen before. They would form a brotherhood, a new kind of order. They would take the sacred monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But they would not spend their days in prayer and seclusion behind monastery walls. They would take up the sword and shield and dedicate their lives, their very souls, to one single, dangerous mission: to protect the pilgrims of the Holy Land. They would become monks in the saddle, prayers on their lips and steel in their hands. With this astonishing proposal, Jacques de Molay sought an audience with King Baldwin. Picture the scene in the royal court of Jerusalem. A small group of 9 knights, their armor worn, their resources meager, standing before the ruler of the kingdom. They had no army, no wealth, no political backing. All they had was their word and their swords. The king was a pragmatic man, beset by enemies on all sides. He must have been skeptical. What could 9 men possibly do that his own armies could not? How could they hope to tame the savage roads that had claimed so many? But Jacques spoke with the fire of true faith. He was not asking for payment or for land. He was offering a total commitment, a permanent spiritual garrison for the kingdom's most vulnerable souls. It was an offer of pure service, an act of supreme piety. Perhaps King Baldwin saw in their eyes the desperate, brilliant light of an idea whose time had come. Perhaps he simply had nothing to lose. He agreed. The king did not just give them his blessing, he gave them a home. He granted the small brotherhood a space for their headquarters in a wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which stood upon the holiest ground in all of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, to the Crusaders. This site was none other than the spot where the legendary Temple of Solomon had once stood. And from this sacred location, this center of the spiritual world, the new order would take its official name. They were to be called the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History would know them by a shorter, more powerful name, the Knights Templar. Their early years were defined by the first part of their name, poor. This was not a pretense. They had no income, living only on the donations given by the king and a few sympathetic nobles. They were so destitute, legend says, that Jacques de Molay and his second-in-command shared a single war horse between them. This image of 2 knights riding one horse became the order's official seal, a potent symbol of their humility and their commitment to communal poverty. While the world around them scrambled for wealth and power, they embraced austerity. They lived the harsh, disciplined life of monks. Their days were a grueling cycle of prayer, military training, and patrols. They rose before dawn for matins, their voices chanting psalms in the cool air of the Temple Mount. They ate their meals in silence, listening to readings from Scripture. They owned nothing personally, not even their own armor or horse, for everything belonged to the order. Their vow of chastity removed the distractions of family and romance, while their vow of obedience bound them to their master's will, as if it were the will of God himself. They were being forged into something new, a weapon of faith, sharpened by discipline and hardened by devotion. For nearly a decade, they remained a small and obscure presence in the Holy Land. They patrolled the road to Jerusalem, their white mantles, not yet adorned with the famous Red Cross, becoming a welcome sight to weary pilgrims. They fought with courage and skill, but there were simply too few of them to make a decisive impact. Back in Europe, they were largely unknown, their strange hybrid of monasticism and knighthood viewed with suspicion by some. They were a noble experiment, but a fragile one. Their survival, let alone their growth, was far from certain. The 9 knights had planted a seed in the holy soil of Jerusalem, but for that seed to grow into the mighty tree that would one day stretch its branches across all of Christendom, it would need water and light. It would need a champion. It would need a voice so powerful and so respected that it could convince the kings, princes, and popes of Europe that this small band of poor soldiers was not just a noble idea, but the very will of God himself. That champion was waiting, and his name was Bernard of Clairvaux. And when he spoke, the world would be changed forever. For nearly a decade, the Knights Templar were a flicker of light in the vast darkness of the Holy Land. They were a noble idea, a courageous handful of men holding fast to a sacred vow. But an idea, no matter how pure, cannot survive on faith alone. It needs fuel. It needs champions. The 9 knights had proven their valor on the dusty roads to Jerusalem. But their future, their very existence, would be decided not in the heat of battle, but in the cold stone halls of power back in Europe. To transform their humble brotherhood into an army of God, Hugues de Payens knew he needed more than just a king's blessing. He needed an endorsement from heaven itself, and to get it, he would have to seek out the most powerful man in Christendom. That man was not a king, nor was he the Pope. He was a humble abbot from the forests of France, a man named Bernard of Clairvaux. To understand the Templars' meteoric rise, you must first understand Bernard. He was a phenomenon, a spiritual superstar in an age of faith. He was a Cistercian monk, thin and ascetic, his body worn down by fasting and prayer, but his spirit was a roaring fire that could set the entire continent ablaze. His words were captivating, his intellect razor-sharp, his piety so profound that it was said to be almost supernatural. When he spoke, kings listened. When he wrote, popes took his counsel. He could start a crusade with a single sermon and end a schism with a series of letters. He was a kingmaker, a power broker, and the undisputed spiritual conscience of his generation. To gain the support of Bernard of Clairvaux was to gain the support of the world. In the year 1127, Hugues de Payens travelled from the Holy Land back to Europe on a critical mission. He was seeking recruits, funds, and legitimacy. His journey led him to Bernard. We can only imagine the meeting between these two men, the weary warrior and the fiery abbot. Hugues, his face weathered by the eastern sun, would have spoken of the grim realities of the pilgrim road, of the faith of those who died upon it, and of his order's radical solution. He would have described a life of prayer punctuated by the clash of steel, a monastery on horseback. In this strange new order, Bernard saw the perfect, living embodiment of his own ideals. He had long wrestled with the paradox of holy war. In a famous work, he would later write an essay called In Praise of the New Knighthood. In it, he contrasted the vain, glorious-seeking secular knights of Europe with the selfless Templars. He argued that for a Templar, killing a malevolent foe was not homicide, but malicide, the killing of evil itself. Their violence was not a sin, but a sacred duty. They were, in his eyes, the true soldiers of Christ, an angel of destruction to the enemies of the faith, and a guardian angel to its followers. Bernard saw in the Templars the future of Christendom, and he threw his immense influence behind them. The first great fruit of this alliance came at the Council of Troyes in 1129. This was a grand assembly of the most important churchmen in France. With Bernard as their advocate, the Knights Templar were no longer a small, informal band of volunteers. They were the main event. Bernard presented their cause with all his fiery eloquence. He personally oversaw the creation of their official code of conduct, the Latin Rule. This was a detailed document of 72 clauses that would govern every aspect of a Templar's life. The rule was a masterpiece of spiritual and military discipline. It dictated the prayers they must say, the plain food they could eat, the simple clothes they could wear. It forbade them from consorting with women, from hunting with hawks, and from having personal possessions, even down to a locked box for their belongings. It prescribed absolute obedience to their master, but it also gave them their defining symbol. The knights of the order were to wear a pure white mantle, a symbol of the chastity and purity of their new life. This white mantle would soon make them an unmistakable sight on the battlefield. At the conclusion of the Council of Troyes, the Knights Templar were officially recognized by the Church. They were now a legitimate monastic order, their mission blessed, their rule sanctified. The floodgates opened. Donations of money, land, and supplies began to pour in from pious nobles across Europe. Young men, fired by Bernard's sermons, flocked to join the order, eager to take up the white mantle. But the most significant endorsement was yet to come. 10 years later, in 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull, a formal decree that would forever change the destiny of the Knights Templar. It was called Omni Datum Optimum, which means every perfect gift, and it was perhaps the most extraordinary grant of power ever given to an organization. This document was, in essence, a spiritual declaration of independence. It placed the Knights Templar under the sole and direct authority of the Pope himself. With a stroke of his pen, Pope Innocent lifted them above the laws of the mortal world. Kings could not command them. Bishops could not tax them. Their members, their property, and their agents were immune from local laws and loyal only to their Grand Master and the Holy See in Rome. They were granted the right to build their own chapels and consecrate their own cemeteries, creating a spiritual state within every state. They were exempt from paying the tithe, the 10% religious tax that all others had to pay. This single decree transformed them from a noble order into a sovereign power, a holy, multinational corporation that answered to no one but God's representative on earth. Their military identity also crystallized. A few years after the papal bull, another pope granted them the right to add a symbol to their white mantles. It was a simple, stark red cross to be worn over their hearts. The symbolism was powerful and immediate. The red of a martyr's blood, worn over the white of a monk's purity. It became one of the most iconic and feared emblems in the medieval world. To see the banner of the Templars, the black and white bow, and the sea of white mantles with their blood-red crosses, was to know that the elite shock troops of Christendom had arrived, and they were, without question, the elite. Recruits poured in, and the order could afford to be selective. They trained relentlessly, and their discipline on the battlefield was legendary. While other Crusader armies were often a chaotic mix of rival nobles, the Templars fought as a single, unified body. Their signature tactic was the devastating, full-tilt cavalry charge. A squadron of Templar knights, riding in a tight, wedge-shaped formation, would accelerate into the enemy line. They did so in an eerie silence, saving their breath, their focus absolute. The impact was like a thunderbolt, shattering enemy formations and striking terror into the hearts of their foes. They were forbidden from retreating unless hopelessly outnumbered, and they were known for fighting to the very last man. They became the backbone of the Crusader armies, the force that could be relied upon when all hope seemed lost. In just 2 decades, the Knights Templar had been utterly transformed. They had gone from 9 poor knights sharing a horse to a vast international institution with the full backing of the Church. They had the most powerful spiritual leader in Europe as their patron and a papal decree that made them a law unto themselves. They were building a network of commanderies, or chapter houses, across Europe, which served as recruitment centers and depots for their holy war. They had become the embodiment of the crusading ideal, pious, disciplined, and lethally effective. They were revered, admired, and feared. They stood at the pinnacle of prestige, seemingly untouchable, an army of God shielded by the endorsement of heaven itself. But power of this magnitude creates ripples, and wealth, which was now beginning to flow into their coffers in astonishing amounts, creates a gravitational pull all its own. Their mission was spiritual, but their influence was now very much of this world. And in the world of men, even the most sacred vow can be viewed with suspicion, and the brightest halo can attract the darkest envy. The Knights Templar had become the sword arm of Christendom, their white mantles a symbol of divine sanction and military might. But the true foundation of their power, the secret that elevated them from a mere military order to an unstoppable global force, was not forged in the fires of battle. It was forged in the quiet, candlelit scriptoriums of their chapter houses. They had mastered the art of war, but they were about to perfect the art of money. And in doing so, they would build an empire of wealth so vast it would rival that of kings, and ultimately seal their own doom. To understand their revolutionary achievement, we must first return to the Pilgrim Road. Imagine you are a wealthy nobleman in the 12th century, a French count who wishes to travel to the Holy Land. Your journey is not just a matter of faith, but a massive logistical and financial challenge. You must fund your travel, your equipment, your retinue of servants and soldiers. This requires a vast sum of gold and silver. But how do you transport it? Carrying a chest laden with coins for thousands of miles is not just impractical. It is an open invitation to every thief and mercenary from Paris to Jerusalem. You would be painting a target on your own back. Many who tried found their pilgrimage ending in a shallow, unmarked grave. The world lacked a fundamental pillar of civilization, a safe, reliable way to move wealth over great distances. It was this problem that the Knights Templar, with their unique network and unimpeachable reputation, were perfectly positioned to solve. They created a system so ingenious, so far ahead of its time, that it can be considered the birth of modern international banking. It worked through a combination of trust, information, and a sprawling infrastructure that spanned the known world. Let us return to our French count. Instead of loading his gold onto a mule, he would travel to the local Templar commandery, the massive, fortified compound in Paris. There, in a secure chamber, he would deposit his fortune with the Templar treasurer. The treasurer and his scribes would meticulously count the coins, record the amount in their great ledgers, and then issue the count a letter. This was no mere receipt. It was a letter of credit, a piece of parchment inscribed with intricate details of the transaction, and sealed with a complex cipher, a code known only to the high-ranking financial masters of the order. The Count could then begin his long journey, carrying nothing more valuable than this single, unassuming piece of parchment. He could travel light and fast, no longer a target for bandits. After months of arduous travel, upon arriving in the Holy Land, he would present his letter at the Templar headquarters in Jerusalem. The Templar master there would verify the code, check it against his own records, which may have arrived separately on a Templar ship, and then, from their own vaults, dispense the equivalent amount in the local currency of the Crusader kingdom. The Templars would take a small, reasonable fee for the service. The transaction was complete. It seems simple now, in our age of digital transfers. But in the 12th century, this was nothing short of financial magic. The Templars had created a web of trust woven across Christendom. They understood that what they were really transferring was not gold, but information, and they were the only organization with the integrity, the security, and the international presence to make it work. This system became wildly popular, and not just with pilgrims. Merchants, kings, and bishops all began to use the Templars as their personal bank. And as more people entrusted them with their wealth, the order's own riches grew exponentially. Nobles, in their wills, would often bequeath vast tracts of land, farms, vineyards, and even entire villages to the order in exchange for prayers for their souls. Suddenly, the Knights Templar were not just soldiers and bankers. They were landlords, farmers, and industrialists. They owned thousands of properties across Europe, from the sheep farms of England to the ports of the Mediterranean. They ran a massive import-export business, using their own fleet of ships to move goods, pilgrims, and treasure between East and West. They were a self-sufficient economic juggernaut, a state within a state. This created a fascinating paradox. The individual Templar knight was still bound by his vow of personal poverty. He owned nothing. His simple tunic, his armor, his horse, all belonged to the order. He could not carry a single coin in his purse without permission. Yet the order itself was becoming fantastically, unimaginably wealthy. All profits, all donations, all revenues flowed into one central treasury, to be used for the greater purpose of defending the faith. A Templar owned nothing, but collectively. He was part of the richest organization in the world. As their financial power grew, so did their function. They evolved from a simple deposit and transfer service into sophisticated money. It was a natural progression. With so much capital sitting in their vaults, it made sense to put it to work. They began to loan huge sums to cash-strapped nobles and, most significantly, to kings. When Richard, the Lionheart of England, needed to finance his crusade, he borrowed from the Templars. When the kings of France needed to fund their wars, they turned to the Paris Temple. The main Templar houses in Paris and London became the de facto national treasuries of France and England. They were more secure than any royal castle, guarded by the most elite soldiers in the world and backed by the authority of the Pope. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar was now one of the most powerful figures in Europe. He was not just the commander of an army, he was an international financier on whose decisions the fates of kingdoms could turn. He counseled kings, arranged royal treaties, and managed the flow of capital that fueled the ambitions of the continent. The order had become the central nervous system of European finance, their commanderies, the ganglia, and their network of roads and ships, the arteries, through which the lifeblood of commerce flowed. The epicenter of this global empire was the Paris Temple. It was a colossal fortress in the heart of the city, a sprawling complex of churches, towers, and administrative buildings, surrounded by a high crenellated wall. It was a world unto itself, a symbol of their immense power and wealth. Inside its walls, it was less a monastery and more the headquarters of a global corporation. Scribes scratched away with quills, recording transactions in dozens of languages. Treasurers weighed gold and silver from 100 different kingdoms. And everywhere, silent, watchful knights in their white mantles stood guard. A constant reminder that this bank was protected by the deadliest army of the age. By the middle of the 13th century, the Knights Templar had reached their zenith. They were a holy order, a crack military unit, a logistical network, and the world's first multinational bank, all rolled into one. Their wealth was legendary, their power absolute, their reputation seemingly unassailable. They had built an empire not on conquest, but on the principles of trust, security, and financial ingenuity. They were the bankers of God, financing his wars and protecting his faithful. But an organization this powerful, this wealthy, and this secretive, accountable to no king and operating beyond the laws of any land, does not merely inspire awe. It inspires envy, and it creates enemies. In the courts of Europe, whispers were beginning. Whispers of greed, of arrogance, of secrets hidden behind the temple walls. The very success that had lifted them to the heavens was making them a target, and one king, in particular, was watching them with a dangerous combination of desperation and greed. The great edifice they had built was strong, but its foundations were about to be shaken to their very core. The Knights Templar were more than an order. They were an institution, a pillar of the Christian world, as solid and sacred as a great cathedral. Their wealth was the bedrock of European finance, and their military prowess was the stuff of legend. From their magnificent temple in Paris to their fortified commanderies scattered across the continent, they were a symbol of permanence and power, seemingly blessed by God and immune to the petty squabbles of mortal men. But in the world of thrones and kingdoms, no power goes unchallenged for long, and the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows. The Templars had reached their sun-drenched peak, but the world around them was changing, and an existential twilight was fast approaching. The beginning of the end came not in a European throne room, but in the last sliver of the Holy Land that Christendom could still call its own. It came in the year 1291 at the siege of the city of Acre. Acre was the last great Crusader stronghold, a vibrant, wealthy port city on the coast of modern-day Israel. It was the final bastion, the last gateway to the east, and the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Al-Ashraf Khalil, was determined to wipe it from the map. He arrived with one of the largest armies the era had ever seen, a vast host of cavalry and siege engines that dwarfed the city's defenders. Inside the walls, the Templars, along with their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller and the Teutonic Knights, mounted a heroic, desperate defense. For weeks, they held back the tide, their discipline and courage a stark contrast to the panic and political infighting that consumed much of the city. But it was a hopeless fight. The Mamluk forces were overwhelming. They breached the walls, and the city descended into a brutal, street-by-street battle. The Templars made their last stand in their own massive seafront fortress. They fought to the last man as the walls came crashing down around them. When Acre fell, it was not just the loss of a city. It was the death of a dream. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land, after nearly 2 centuries, was over. The news hit Europe like a tremor. The fall of Acre triggered a profound crisis of faith and identity, and no one felt this crisis more acutely than the military orders. The Knights Templar had been founded with one primary, sacred purpose: to defend the Holy Land and its pilgrims. But now, the Holy Land was lost. Their entire reason for being, their raison d'etre, had vanished in the smoke and rubble of Acre. The question began to be asked, first in whispers, then in open court and crowded taverns: what are the Templars for now? They were no longer seen as heroic warriors fighting on a distant frontier. They were seen as what they had also become: immensely wealthy landlords and bankers, living in grand, fortress-like compounds in the richest cities in Europe. The public perception began to shift. Admiration curdled into suspicion. Respect soured into resentment. Why, people asked, Does an order of monks sworn to poverty possess more wealth than any kingdom? If their holy war is over, why are they still collecting donations and commanding such power? The whispers that had once been dismissed were now finding fertile ground, and one man was listening to these whispers more closely than anyone. He was King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. The name referred to his handsome, emotionless features, not to the fairness of his character. Philip was a new breed of monarch. He was intensely ambitious, ruthlessly efficient, and driven by a cold, fanatical piety. He believed himself to be God's chosen agent on earth, and he saw the glory and power of France as being inseparable from the will of God. Anything that stood in the way of France's power, therefore, stood in the way of God's plan, and the Knights Templar were a formidable obstacle. Philip's motives were a toxic trinity of debt, ambition, and a twisted sense of devotion. Firstly, and most pressingly, he was in catastrophic debt. His wars against the English and the Flemish had drained the royal treasury. He had already debased the currency, persecuted the Jews and the Lombard bankers, seizing their assets to pay his bills, and his single biggest creditor was the Knights Templar. The Paris temple held the kingdom's finances, and Philip's own, in a grip of debt that was both immense and humiliating. Secondly, the Templars offended his ambition for absolute power. They were a sovereign entity operating within his kingdom. They commanded thousands of men, controlled hundreds of properties, and possessed a vast treasure, all while being completely outside of his legal jurisdiction. They were a state within his state, a challenge to his royal authority that he could not tolerate. He was determined to forge a centralized, all-powerful French monarchy, and the Templars stood in his way. Finally, Philip may have genuinely believed, or convinced himself, that the rumors about the Templars were true. In his fanatical worldview, an order that had failed in its holy mission and had grown so worldly and wealthy must surely be corrupt, even heretical. To destroy such an order and seize its wealth for the holy cause of strengthening his own kingdom would not be an act of theft, but an act of righteous purification. But attacking the Templars was like attacking the Church itself. They were protected by the Pope, their only master. A direct assault was impossible. Philip was a patient predator, and he began to lay a meticulous trap. His chief instrument was his chancellor and keeper of the seal, a ruthless and brilliant lawyer named Guillaume de Nagaret. Nagaret was a man for whom the law was not a tool for justice, but a weapon for power. Under his direction, a sinister campaign began. Nagaret's agents started to gather evidence. They sought out disgruntled or expelled Templars, men with grievances against the order, and encouraged them to talk. The most prominent of these was a man named Esquin de Floyan, who claimed to have knowledge of heretical practices within the order's secret initiation ceremonies. Under pressure and likely torture, these men spun dark tales. They spoke of new recruits being forced to deny Christ and spit on the cross. They whispered of secret rituals held at midnight, of the worship of a strange, bearded head known as Baphomet, of institutionalized debauchery. These accusations, a shocking cocktail of heresy and blasphemy, were precisely what Nagaret needed to build his case. While his agents worked in the shadows, Philip moved to neutralize the Templars' greatest protector, the papacy. Through political maneuvering, he had managed to secure the election of a French archbishop as Pope Clement V. Clement was a weak, vacillating man who owed his position to Philip. In a stunning power play, Philip then pressured Clement to move the entire papal court from Rome to Avignon, a city in southern France. The papacy was now effectively a captive of the French crown. The trap was now almost complete. Philip had his motives. He had his legal architect in Nogaret. He had his manufactured evidence and his stable of coerced witnesses. And he had a weak, pliable pope under his thumb. The Templars, meanwhile, remained largely oblivious. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was an old warrior, a veteran of the final battles in the Holy Land, but not a savvy political player. He trusted in the Order's reputation, in its papal protections, and in its fundamental innocence. He could not comprehend the sheer scale of the conspiracy being woven around him. He could not see the shadow of the throne lengthening over his order, a shadow that was about to plunge the Knights Templar into a night from which they would never emerge. The storm was no longer gathering. It was directly overhead, and the date was set. The autumn of 1307 was a cool and quiet one in Paris. The business of the kingdom proceeded as usual, and the great fortress of the Paris Temple stood as it always had, a silent, imposing testament to the power of the Knights Templar. In the first days of October, the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, had been an honored guest in the city. He had attended the funeral of the king's sister-in-law, walking among the highest nobles of the realm as a pallbearer. He had no reason to suspect that the courteous, handsome king who greeted him was the architect of his impending doom. He felt secure, protected by the Pope, by the Order's century-spanning legacy, and by his own innocence. It was a fatal miscalculation. On the evening of Thursday, October 12th, a cold peace settled over France. Inside the thick stone walls of Templar commanderies across the kingdom, the knights followed the rhythm of their monastic life. They attended Vespers, the evening prayer service, their chanted psalms echoing in the stone chapels. They ate their sparse supper in silence. As night fell, they retired to their dormitories, unaware that for most of them, it would be the last night of peace they would ever know. They were soldiers of God, sleeping in the heart of a kingdom they had long served and protected. They did not know that the kingdom itself had just declared a secret, undeclared war upon them. Weeks earlier, King Philip, in an act of staggering logistical and administrative audacity, had dispatched sealed orders to his royal officials, the seneschals and bailiffs in every district of France. The instructions were precise, and the penalty for reading them before the appointed time was death. The letters were to be opened simultaneously, nationwide, just before dawn on the following day. That day was Friday, October the 13th, as the first hint of grey light touched the eastern sky. A kingdom-wide trap was sprung. In cities and towns all across France, from the bustling port of Marseille to the quiet farms of Normandy, the king's men unsealed their orders. They read the shocking contents, assembled their soldiers, and moved quietly through the pre-dawn gloom. Their targets were the Templar houses. In Paris, the operation was overseen by the king's own iron fist, Guillaume de Molay. He led a force of armed soldiers to the gates of the Paris Temple, that seemingly impregnable fortress. They did not lay siege. They did not storm the walls. They simply knocked. The Templars were caught completely, utterly by surprise. Roused from their sleep, they found themselves surrounded by the king's men. And here, a crucial, tragic detail of the story unfolds. The Templars were among the most formidable and battle-hardened warriors in the world. They were armed, and they were in their own fortress. They could have mounted a fierce, bloody resistance, but they did not. They did not draw their swords. They did not raise a shield, because the men arresting them were not a foreign enemy. They were soldiers of the King of France, carrying a royal warrant, and claiming to act with the blessing of the Holy Inquisition in the name of the Church. The Templars' own vows of obedience, their respect for the royal and religious authority they had sworn to uphold, became their undoing. They were paralyzed by betrayal. They were arrested not as soldiers, but as common criminals, and they submitted to their fate with a stunned, disbelieving compliance. That morning, thousands of Templars were taken into custody, from the Grand Master himself down to the youngest sergeants and chaplains. The efficiency and scale of the operation was terrifying, and as the sun rose higher, Philip's propaganda machine roared to life. Royal officials read the list of official charges in town squares across the country. The public, who had for centuries revered the Templars as the ultimate heroes of the faith, listened in horrified disbelief. The charges were a masterwork of calculated slander, designed to provoke maximum shock and revulsion in the medieval mind. The knights, it was claimed, were not soldiers of Christ, but agents of Satan. During their secret initiation ceremonies, new recruits were forced to deny Jesus, to spit upon the crucifix, and to trample it underfoot. They were accused of worshipping a demonic, bearded head, an idol they called Baphomet. The charges alleged that the leaders encouraged institutionalized homosexuality, and finally, they were accused of massive financial fraud and greed, of using their sacred mission as a cover for their own avarice. It was a complete and total character assassination. In the space of a single morning, Philip had transformed the heroes of Christendom into its most monstrous villains, with the Templars imprisoned and their reputation shattered. The second, darker phase of the king's plan began. The prisoners were handed over to the king's inquisitors. The goal of the Inquisition, it must be understood, was not to find the truth. It was to secure a confession. In the medieval mindset, a heretic who confessed could have their soul saved, even if their body had to be punished. A confession was therefore seen as an act of mercy, and any means necessary to obtain one was justified. The Templars were now subjected to the systematic, scientific application of agony. In the dark, damp dungeons of castles across France, the knights endured torments designed to break the strongest of wills. They were starved and deprived of sleep for days on end. They were subjected to the rack, a device that slowly stretched the body until joints were dislocated. Many were subjected to the strappado hoisted into the air by their wrists, which were tied behind their backs and then dropped repeatedly, tearing the shoulders from their sockets. A common torture involved smearing a knight's feet with grease, binding them in front of a fire, and roasting them until the flesh burned and the bones were exposed. These were men who had faced death without flinching on the battlefield. But this was a different kind of enemy. This was not the clean, swift death of combat. This was a slow, grinding descent into unimaginable pain and despair, administered by men who claimed to be doing God's work. It is no surprise that under such conditions, many broke. Dozens of knights, their bodies broken and their minds shattered, confessed to anything their tormentors demanded. They confessed to spitting on the cross. They confessed to heresy. They confessed to crimes they could not have even imagined before. But Philip knew that the confessions of rank-and-file knights were not enough. He needed the ultimate prize. He needed the confession of the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. The aging warrior was held in solitary confinement, isolated from his order, and subjected to immense psychological pressure. He was told that his brothers were confessing, that the evidence was overwhelming, and that the only way to save the order and its members from total destruction was to admit to some wrongdoing. broken by his ordeal and likely misled into believing he was protecting his men. Jacques de Molay confessed. He admitted that the initiation ceremony included the act of denying Christ, though he claimed it was merely a symbolic test of obedience. It didn't matter. The king had what he wanted. The Grand Master's confession was a devastating blow. Philip immediately publicized it, presenting it as irrefutable proof of the order's guilt. In the court of public opinion, the case was now closed. The Knights Templar were heretics. Their own leader had said so. Philip's plan had unfolded with brutal, flawless precision. The order was in chains, its name was a curse, and its leaders were disgraced. All hope seemed to be extinguished in the cold darkness of the royal dungeons. The king had won. But the story was not quite over. For news of the arrests and the brutal methods used to extract confessions was reaching the Pope in Avignon. And even a weak man can be pushed too far. The king's victory was absolute, but the final judgment had not yet been passed. The news of the mass arrests and the horrifying confessions, extracted under torture, sent a shockwave through the papal court in Avignon. Pope Clement V was a weak man, a political pawn, but he was still the Pope. The Knights Templar were his direct subjects, a holy order under the special protection of the Holy See. King Philip, in his ruthless efficiency, had committed a profound breach of protocol. He had usurped papal authority, and Clement, for a moment, was stirred to action. He was outraged, not just by the injustice, but by the blatant challenge to his own power. In November of 1307, just a month after the raids, Clement issued a papal bull ordering all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars in their own lands, but, crucially, to hold their property in the name of the Church, not the Crown. He then suspended the authority of the king's inquisitors and declared that the investigation would now be a papal affair. He sent his own hand-picked cardinals to Paris to interview the leaders of the order directly. For the imprisoned knights, it was a sudden, desperate ray of hope in the darkness of their dungeons. The Pope had finally come to their rescue. The truth would now be heard, and for a time it seemed it would be. In the summer of 1308, when scores of Templars were brought before the Pope's representatives, away from the immediate threat of King Philip's torturers, a remarkable wave of courage swept through them. Knight after knight stood up and recanted their confessions. They told the cardinals harrowing stories of the torments they had endured, showing the scars and mutilated limbs to prove it. The most significant retraction came from the Grand Master himself. Jacques de Molay, shamed by his moment of weakness, found his warrior spirit again. He formally recanted his confession, stating that he had only admitted guilt under great duress, and that the order was innocent of all charges of heresy. Hundreds of his brothers followed his example. It seemed as though Philip's entire case, built on a foundation of coerced confessions, was about to collapse. But King Philip the Fair had not come this far only to be thwarted by the truth. He was a master of political blackmail, and he held the ultimate weapon over Pope Clement's head. Philip launched a vicious public campaign against one of Clement's predecessors, the long-dead Pope Boniface VIII, who had been a bitter enemy of the French crown. Philip threatened to put the dead Pope on trial for heresy, a move that would create a scandal so immense it could shatter the authority of the Church for generations. The unspoken threat to Clement was clear: defy me on the Templar issue, and I will burn the very institution you lead to the ground. While Clement was paralyzed by this threat, Philip and his lawyer, Nogaret, unleashed a second, even more brutal move. they invoked a cruel and terrifying doctrine of Inquisition law. A person who confesses to heresy and is shown mercy, but then later recants that confession, is deemed a relapsed heretic. For a relapsed heretic, there was no need for a further trial. The sentence was automatic and absolute: death by fire. In May of 1310, in a field outside of Paris, Philip made a horrific example. 54 Knights Templar, all of whom had bravely recanted their confessions to the Papal Commission, were declared relapsed heretics. They were loaded onto carts, driven to the field, and burned at the stake in a great, horrific pyre. Eyewitnesses reported that they met their end with extraordinary courage, singing hymns and proclaiming the innocence of their holy order until the flames consumed them. The message was sent, loud and clear, to every other Templar in a French prison: if you recant, you will burn. The defiance was brutally extinguished. The final act of this political tragedy was set for the Council of Vienne in 1312. This Grand Church Council was officially convened by the Pope to deliver a final verdict on the order's fate. But it was a trial in name only. Philip marched his army to the outskirts of the city, a menacing presence that loomed over the proceedings. Inside the council, despite years of torture and intimidation, the commission appointed to study the case actually voted in favor of the Templars, finding insufficient evidence to convict the order as a whole of heresy. But Philip was not interested in evidence. He wanted a verdict. He personally stormed into the council, pressuring the weak-willed Clement with his intimidating presence. The Pope was trapped. He could not declare the order guilty, as the evidence did not support it. But he did not dare defy the king. So he chose a third option, a masterpiece of political cowardice. He issued the papal bull Vox in it, he stated that, though he could not legally convict the order, for the good of the Church and to end the great scandal that the trial had become, he was administratively dissolving the Knights Templar, suppressing it by an inviolable and perpetual decree. They were not declared guilty. They were simply erased. Another bull, ad providum, decreed that all Templar property was to be transferred to their great rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. In reality, Philip and other monarchs made sure to seize the lion's share for themselves, claiming vast administrative fees for their troubles. The king had finally gotten what he wanted. The Templars' bank was broken, and he held the assets. The order was gone, but its leaders remained, languishing in a royal dungeon for years as their fate was debated. The end finally came on March 18th, 1314. A scaffold was built on the Parvis, the public square in front of the magnificent Cathedral of Notre Dame. Jacques de Molay and 3 of his top commanders, including the brave Geoffrey de Charny, were led out into the daylight for the first time in years. They were old men now, broken by 7 years of brutal imprisonment. The cardinals read their final sentence. Because they had confessed, they would be shown mercy and condemned to a life of perpetual imprisonment. All they had to do was publicly reaffirm their guilt one last time. But something inside Jacques de Molay, the old warrior, would not allow this final lie. As the cardinals finished, a silence fell over the crowd. And into that silence, the Grand Master, to the absolute shock of everyone present, found his voice. He stood tall and declared that at the moment of his death, he knew he was in the presence of God, and that to lie at such a moment would be the foulest of sins. He proclaimed that the order was pure and holy, and that his confession had been a falsehood, wrung from him by the pain of torture. He declared that he deserved to die the cruelest death for that one great sin of lying against his brothers. Next to him, Geoffrey de Charny loudly echoed his words, also proclaiming their innocence. The cardinals were stunned into silence. The crowd was in an uproar, but King Philip, who was present, was filled with a cold rage. This public defiance was a final insult he would not tolerate. His decision was instantaneous. There would be no more delays. As relapsed heretics, they had condemned themselves. That very evening, he ordered them to be put to death, as dusk fell over Paris. A stake was erected on a small island in the river Seine, in view of the royal palace. Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny were led to it. They were tied to the stake, and the pyre was lit. Chroniclers of the event reported that they faced their horrifying end with a composure that astonished the crowd. They asked to have their hands unbound so they could die in prayer, and turned their faces towards the cathedral. And as the flames rose around him, legend says that the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar raised his voice one final time. From within the fire, he issued a terrible curse, summoning both Pope Clement and King Philip to meet him before the judgment seat of God within a year. The flames roared, and then there was only silence. The last Grand Master was dead. The order was ashes. The story was over, or so it seemed, for a curse had been laid, and all of France would now wait to see if the ghost of the Grand Master would have his final, terrible revenge. The fire on the Ile-de-la site burned down to embers, and the ashes of the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar were swept away by the dark waters of the Seine. In the eyes of King Philip the Fair, the story was over. He had won. He had crushed his enemies, broken his creditors, and consolidated his power. The Templar threat was neutralized, their great wealth now flowing into his own coffers. But history is rarely so neat, and the dead have a way of lingering, especially those who die with a curse on their lips. Jacques de Molay had summoned a king and a pope to a higher court, and all of France, whether they believed in curses or not, held its breath. The first part of the curse did not take long to manifest. Just 1 month after Mal's execution, Pope Clement V, who had been suffering from a debilitating illness, died in agony. The circumstances were grim. A contemporary chronicler wrote that his body was consumed by a fire that broke out during the night vigil, leaving his corpse a charred ruin. Later that year, the second part of the curse found its mark. King Philip the Fair, a strong and healthy man of 46, suffered a stroke while out hunting. He was thrown from his horse and died a few weeks later, unable to speak. And to complete the trifecta of doom, the chief architect of the conspiracy, the ruthless Guillaume de Navarre, also died suddenly within that same fateful year. To the people of the 14th century, this was no coincidence. It was the clear and terrifying hand of divine retribution. The curse had been fulfilled. The Grand Master's ghost had claimed his revenge from beyond the grave. This dramatic and spooky epilogue cemented the Templar saga in the popular imagination, transforming it from a story of political persecution into a dark Gothic legend. The fall of the House of Capet, Philip's royal dynasty, which collapsed within a generation due to a lack of male heirs, was also seen by many as the final flowering of Mal's curse. But the fulfillment of a curse was not the only mystery left behind in the smoking ruins of the Order. Two greater, more tangible questions haunted the courts and treasure hunters of Europe for centuries to come. What happened to the Templar fleet? And more importantly, what happened to their treasure? On the eve of the arrests in 1307, the Templars maintained a significant naval fleet based at the port of La Rochelle, their main Atlantic naval base. When the king's men arrived to seize the port, they found the docks eerily empty. The entire fleet, laden with an unknown cargo and an unknown number of knights, had vanished into the night, never to be seen again. Where did they go? History has no certain answer, only tantalizing theories. Some say they sailed to Scotland, which was at war with England and had been excommunicated by the Pope, making it a safe harbour. There, it is said, they aided Robert the Bruce in his famous victory at the Battle of Bannock. Others believe they sailed to Portugal, where the king refused to persecute the Templars and instead rebranded them as the Knights of Christ, who would later play a central role in the Age of Discovery. Still others whisper that they crossed the Atlantic a century before Columbus, guided by maps and secret knowledge acquired in the Holy Land, and buried their treasure in the New World. And then there is the treasure itself. When Nogaret's men stormed the Paris Temple, the financial heart of the empire, they expected to find a vast hoard of gold, silver, and jewels. They found the ledgers, the financial records of an international bank, but the great treasure vaults were strangely empty. In the days leading up to the raid, it seems the Templars, tipped off to the coming danger, had spirited away the bulk of their mobile wealth. Carts were seen leaving the Paris Temple under the cover of darkness, heading for an unknown destination. This lost treasure has become the stuff of legend, a historical mystery that rivals that of El Dorado or Atlantis. What was it? Was it merely gold and silver, or was it something far more valuable? Over the centuries, a mythology has grown up that the Templars' true treasure was not material, but spiritual and historical. Legends claim that during their time excavating beneath the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, they had discovered the greatest relics of the Judeo-Christian world. Perhaps it was the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest that held the 10 Commandments. Or perhaps, most famously, it was the Holy Grail, the cup that Christ used at the Last Supper. The keepers of this sacred knowledge, it is said, were the true inner circle of the order, and their secret is what Philip was truly after. This idea has fired the imaginations of writers and mystics for generations, suggesting the Templars were not just knights, but guardians of a sacred bloodline or a hidden, suppressed truth about the origins of Christianity. This air of mystery and secret knowledge is what allowed the Templar spirit, if not the order itself, to survive. In the 18th century, several branches of the burgeoning Freemasonic movement began to incorporate Templar themes, symbols, and legends into their rituals and degrees. The Freemasons, with their own emphasis on brotherhood, secret knowledge, and symbolic building, saw in the Knights Templar a spiritual and chivalric ancestor. Degrees like the Knight Templar became, and remain, some of the highest honors within the York Rite of Freemasonry. Though historians agree there is no direct unbroken lineage between the historical Templars and modern Freemasonry, the symbolic connection is powerful. It ensured that the name and the iconography of the Templars would never truly die, but would instead be preserved in the secret lodges and esoteric traditions of the modern world. So what, in the end, is the true legacy of the Knights Templar? They were a paradox, an institution that was both holy and violent, pious and fantastically wealthy, admired and brutally destroyed. Their true story is one of innovation. They were not just warriors. They were logisticians and administrators. They created a system of international banking and resource management that was centuries ahead of its time, laying the groundwork for the global economies of the future. Their story is also a timeless cautionary tale. It is a story about the intoxicating danger of combining religious fervor with military power. It is a story about how secrecy and immense wealth can breed suspicion and envy. And above all, it is a story of how a powerful, centralized state, driven by debt and ambition, can use the tools of propaganda, fear, and the law itself to crush any institution that stands in its way. The fate of the Templars is a chilling reminder that no organization, no matter how powerful or respected, is safe when it becomes an obstacle to the ambitions of a ruthless and determined king, from the dusty roads of Jerusalem to the dungeons of Paris, from the battlefields of the Crusades to the heart of a global financial empire. The saga of the Knights Templar is a grand, sweeping epic. They were heroes and bankers, monks and martyrs, and though their order was destroyed, their story escaped the flames. It survived in the whispers of a fulfilled curse, in the enduring mysteries of a lost fleet and a hidden treasure, and in the secret rituals of societies that still invoked their name. They are a potent reminder that while empires can fall and men can die, the power of a great legend is truly immortal.